Good evening. I'm Ann Applebaum, and I'm the director of the Transitions Forum here at the Al-Gaddafi Institute. And I'm really, really pleased tonight to be here launching this paper, Libya, Whose Land Is It? Property Rights and Transition. This paper is part of a series of case studies that we've done over the last several years, in which we try to bring together different kinds of expertise and put together not just one writer, but 2 or 3 writers who work on a particular subject. And we also look for people with experience from other places to bring to countries that are in difficulties. The authors of this paper, one of the authors could not be here tonight because he's ill, Tarek Megarisi, which I'm very sorry about. But we do have tonight the second co-author, Mary Fitzgerald, who is probably known to all of you in this room. She's an analyst, journalist specializing in post-Gaddafi Libya. She has reported from Libya since February 2011, which means right from the important date, and is a contributing author to the Libyan Revolution and its aftermath, a book which has just appeared. Not replacing Tarek, but complementing him and supplementing him. We're really, really pleased to have Abdul Rahman Al-Ajali, who is a co-founder of the Libyan Youth Forum and formerly a security advisor at the Office of the Libyan Prime Minister and deputy head of the Interministerial Committee on Border Affairs. So is a former Libyan official, and he's really graciously agreed to be on this panel tonight, replacing our author. And finally, I'm especially happy to have Rodri Williams here. He was a contributor to the paper, that he was one of the readers of it, and he provided a good deal of perspective from the outside. He's based in Stockholm. He works for the International Legal Assistance Consortium and coordinates rule of law programs in 7 countries of the Middle East and North Africa. But he has also been to Libya, I think in 2012, worked there also on property issues as well. So we really have 3 good experts. I know also that there are a number of, I can recognize some of you, there's some very good experts in the room tonight. So we'll try and make use of what everybody knows. The paper is about property rights, and when we first started working on it, some people said, oh, well, why are you doing property rights? There's so many worse things happening in Libya. But as we looked at it and as we talked about it, especially with the group of people here, we concluded that there are some fundamental issues in Libya. There are problems that the country faces that really date from the Gaddafi era. And some of those problems have continued to fester and are the real source of the violence and instability there today. And we decided to pick this one and look at it almost as a sort of almost symbolically. You know, what went wrong? How was property abused in the past? Private property rights abused? What's happened since 2011? And how the solution to this problem could help solve bigger problems in Libya. So that's the rationale for the paper. I do recommend that you all read it. We won't, of course, get into all the details tonight because it's a very, it includes an analysis both of the Gaddafi period and the post-Gaddafi period, and contains also recommendations at the end. But I'll let the authors speak about that. I thought we'd start rather gently on this subject, and we will start somewhat unfairly with Abdul, who's the one who's joined the panel at the last minute. If you could set up for the audience, there's some Libyan experts here, but there's some who aren't. If you could explain a little bit about the background to the problem and why was the confiscation of property was such a significant feature of life in Gaddafi's Libya, and the abolition of private property even. Can you explain why that was? What's the background to that subject?
I think what the report tackles very well, and it uses the detail and the historical developments relating to private property and the private sector in general. What it analyzes and what the deep causes are the evolution of Gaddafi's narrative over different periods of his rule. Gaddafi from 69 to 76 was a different Gaddafi from 77 to 84, was a different Gaddafi in the late 80s and a different Gaddafi in the 90s and the 2000s. And when seen through the lens of control and the creation of patronage systems, then all of these decisions make sense. The implementation of policy in Libya was done through parallel institutions, which were temporary in their nature. And the formal institutions, the ministries, the nationalized public sector and the state-owned companies, were used as vehicles for the manifestation and continuation of a patronage system and a vehicle for the payment of salaries to what became around 80% of the Libyan workforce, without actually being able and functional in terms of implementing policy. So they weren't tools for the implementation of policy. And that is the same till now. The social contract that Gaddafi created, which all of these institutions and temporary and formal really represent, was a social contract that many rentier states use. It was a relationship of dependency using the income from the hydrocarbon sector to basically eliminate the incentives for accountability and transparency and democracy. A payment to the individual Libyan citizen. In return, there is no incentive for holding the government accountable, because the state does not rely on the citizen in any kind of economic or productive capacity. There is no productivity being extracted by the citizen, and therefore the citizen is then dependent. And although in some cases it's contrary to Gaddafi's ideology, I believe what the report details is that the primary objective from Gaddafi's point of view was the sustainability of his rule over time, even over the cliches that he was propagating in his ideology, which was power to the people and the people being the owners of political and economic empowerment, which in actual fact was clearly the opposite. So that's just kind of a basic summary without going into too much detail, I guess.
Roger, you were first in Libya in early 2012. Can you talk a little bit about how you came from having worked on property issues in other places, including Bosnia? Can you talk about how Libya looked to you? What did you see when you first arrived? How did the property? What was the significance of the property issue?
I think that it was quite typical in the sense that there were a set of property conflicts that had quite long antecedents that went back quite far in time. And in some ways, the decisions taken by the Gaddafi regime built on and were meant in some senses to address perceived and very real property injustices from the previous Italian colonial period, for instance. But the point was that there were deeply felt grievances about property and about many other things that contributed to a conflict that had resulted in a new round of grievances, including property grievances. So
the fight over property, or the disputes over property, were fueling wider disputes?
Yes, exactly, and sort of reproducing themselves. For a lot of the revolutionary groups, there was a sense that the displacement of some of the communities that really suffered during the revolution was a direct form of restitution, was taking back land that had unjustly been given to other communities by the Gaddafi regime, for instance. And yet that, of course, fueled the conflict that we see now in Libya.
Mary, you had a lot of experience in post-Gaddafi Libya. There were some efforts made to resolve this issue and to deal with it at the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit about those, unpack those for a little bit, and explain why they failed?
Well, actually, this was an issue. I think there was a recognition, even in the middle of the revolution, that this was a huge source of grievance and was going to be a major factor in the post-revolutionary period. The Constitutional Declaration, which was drafted in August 2011, that was before Gaddafi was killed, before the liberation was declared in October of that year, specifically mentioned property. So there was that expectation that this was going to be a very big issue in the transitionary phase. And I think, I mean, my own personal experience on the ground, I was in Tripoli when Tripoli fell in August 2011, and immediately you saw people trying to claim property. Graffiti went up on specific properties in Tripoli, basically saying this property belongs to family XYZ, who would have owned it decades before. So, and there were armed groups basically rushing in, trying to seize property. There was very much that sense at that time that things were up for grabs. And I think there was a sense also on the part of the transitional authorities that while they felt the need and the urgency to address this issue sooner rather than later, events on the ground, as is so often the case in Libya, would overtake their efforts, whether within a legislative framework or other. And what we saw with the National Congress, which was elected in Libya's first post-Gaddafi elections in summer 2012, there were efforts within the Congress to address this issue. Indeed, several Congress members told me that it was the issue that very often was the most common issue that came up when they dealt with their constituents. So they knew that there was very much this kind of popular sense that, that people wanted this addressed. But yet they failed to pass legislation on this, which I think the failure to pass legislation to address this particular issue tells us a lot of things about the failure of the transition in so many different respects. I think there was a sense amongst a lot of the elected representatives and officials more generally that this issue was such a Pandora's box that in opening it, you would open up all kinds of unpredictable dynamics, and no one really wanted to touch that as a result. So a lot of elected representatives made the point to me that they felt it was better that this issue would be addressed whenever a constitution was drafted and there was some kind of stronger framework in which to work with. We saw in December some of the preliminary draft papers related to what may be the constitution that's finally put to the Libyan people in a referendum, make specific references to property. So there is a real recognition that this is an issue that needs to be tackled sooner rather than later.
Abdul, does that reflect your experience in the Libyan government? How central was this issue? How hard did people try to deal with it?
There was more pressure and more activity on this issue by the civil society more than government. It was the source of various conflicts that happened at the grassroots level between different tribes and different areas. There are historical land ownership issues, and one of the points made in the report was the destruction of the land ownership registry in the 80s, which some say was on purpose by Gaddafi in order to create this type of reorganization, if you will. There were issues between Zintan and Shershia, there were issues in the east of Libya, there were issues in the west of Libya, all pertaining to historical claims to land. It was very prevalent, but I don't feel that the government did enough. One of the reasons was not necessarily a lack of intention, but the same way in all of the other sectors of the government, an inability to implement policy at the institutional level, which is really the issue that is more concerning, and the issue that is at the heart of most of the political disputes in the country now. How can the patronage system, the old social contract, be reversed and be changed? Is there a new vision for what the politics and socio-economic empowerment issues for the citizen? Is there a new vision for that post-revolution? Or are we going to be continuing with the previous social contract and the previous patronage system, but without the unified command that Gaddafi had over it, a fragmented authoritarian regime?
Could the privatization of property, maybe that's not the right word for it, but the redistribution, privatization of property, the restoration of property rights, could that play a role in empowering people? Is that something?
It would be one factor. In terms of rights, the legal rights of the citizen and the fact that private property cannot be confiscated from them was clearly outlined in the constitutional draft, the temporary one created by the NTC. How compensation was distributed, how that's implemented in practice is a completely different story, but a lot of that is not just related to the state of the judiciary, but also to the state of the security sector. And that's the issue that Mary covered very well. What's the influence of the mass armament of the population and the creation of armed groups, sometimes who are either quasi-state or non-state, but who have regional, tribal, private interests at the heart of that armed group's activity. And one of them may be to either protect previous property claims or to create new claims, which is prevalent all over Libya at the moment.
And this, this question of even if the Congress, even if the Minister of Justice was able to, they did draft, actually the Minister of Justice did draft proposing to amend the controversial law number 4. But even if they had passed this law through the Congress and that, the question was, how could they have possibly implemented it? And the Minister of Justice, former Minister of Justice, Salah Marghani, made the point to me that in the current security situation, it's impossible to implement any law. So that would have been a massive challenge.
Implement meaning the law on nationalization of private abolition of private property.
Implement and enforce the law, yes.
I think, if I can just add one thing, a lot of property owners and people who have had their property taken from them as a result of the decree allowing only one property are willing to accept a court decision and then wait, whether it takes 10 or 20 years, for the implementation, as long as legally speaking they have some kind of right preserved and enshrined in law. When the security situation improves, it does show that there is a hope one day that the security situation will improve and they'll be able to have the court decision implemented.
Rodri, could you talk a little bit about how you see the property issue relating to broader conversation about transitional justice and reconciliation in Libya? Because that's something you've written on before.
Yeah, I think one of the really problematic legacies from the Gaddafi period is a sort of zero-sum politics that continues to the current day. We see it very much in the negotiations to try to end the fighting in Libya now. Under Gaddafi, it took the form of basically trying to crush all possible sources of opposition. And it's sort of continued to manifest itself in the area of transitional justice with the original passing of legislation on transitional justice, which defined victims solely as people who had been victimized by the Gaddafi regime, which is very problematic in the sense that there were a lot of people who had been victimized as a result of the revolution itself, who were essentially left out by that definition and would have no chance to be recognized as victims and receive some form of redress. Politically, it set a very important signal. And I think with regard to property, it's been the same type of discourse. It's been effectively zero-sum discourse. Looking at Gaddafi's confiscation of property under Law Number 4 from the 1970s, the question has essentially been, do we entirely overturn it and all of its effects and try to give all the property that was initially taken back then back to the people who lost it or their heirs? Everything in favor of the legal owners. Or on the other hand, do we just forget about it and move on? And leave the thousands of families that are now occupying these properties, that in many cases feel that they legally own them, have paid some value to be able to register ownership. Maybe the third generation of people living in these properties allow them to simply maintain possession. And I think the lesson that you see from a lot of international cases is that, and from human rights practice, is that the solution has to land somewhere in the middle. Absolutely, there should be court judgments recognizing the legal owners and recognizing their ownership. Does that always mean that they should automatically get the property back? And that the family that is living in the property now should automatically lose possession of it? That might be another question. There must be some form of redress. But you have to try to find a place somewhere in the middle between those two extreme positions. I think that's what the Marghani draft that was before the previous parliament was aiming at. But it's very difficult to arrive at that.
Are there international examples that you think would be particularly useful for Libya? Are there precedents? Are there places one could look, not for a blueprint, but for some inspiration for how some of these things might be dealt with?
Well, very nearby you have Cyprus, and I did write a little bit in the report about the Cyprus case. And what makes Cyprus quite interesting is that the confiscations that occurred in Cyprus as a result of a conflict in which Turkey eventually invaded and occupied the northern half of the island occurred at around the same time, the 1970s, as the confiscations in Libya. The crucial difference is that Cyprus is under the jurisdiction of a major regional human rights court, the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And the court, after a series of decisions recognizing major violations of property rights on behalf of the Greek Cypriots, who were the sort of most affected by the confiscations in Cyprus, eventually came to a major decision in 2013, where they said, despite the fact that there are clear property violations in Cyprus, that does not call for that. We do not automatically endorse a response that says all the property must be given back at once. They said if you have that type of a mass restitution scheme, you have to have a framework built in to make sure that the families that are living in those claimed properties, that don't have ownership rights that we would recognize, but which do have privacy rights in their homes, the basic right to continue living in their homes, or else receive some form of compensation if they're forced to leave those homes, that those rights are respected too, that they're put in the balance. They might not be the prevalent ones, but they have to be taken into account.
Mary, you've written about, I think it's in the paper, this sort of Libyan exceptionalism. You know, you say that a lot of Libyans argue that their experience of this issue is completely unique, and you know that they can't learn. There are no lessons from Eastern Europe because it was so different. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this expression Libyan exceptionalism, which I refer to quite a bit, it's not just in relation to this particular issue. I think it's a whole range of issues to do with the transition and that. Libyans will often tell you that what we experienced under Gaddafi was unique. There was nothing like it elsewhere in the world. And for me personally, I think that this acts as an obstacle to actually learning, obviously, from other contexts and moving on and making progress on some of these very prickly issues. But there is, you know, in the paper I quote one particular activist who's prominent in the Rabitat, which is the biggest civil society group which was actively involved in lobbying and campaigning on this issue. And he had studied several case contexts in Eastern Europe, and he said, we have nothing to learn from this. Our society is unique. He said it's a Muslim, Arab, Bedouin society. You can't compare it to Eastern Europe, so we can't learn anything from it. But I think that's a mental block that you know, many people who make that argument need to move beyond that before they can actually start finding solutions to some of these problems.
Do either of you have any thoughts about how international actors have played, and not just what kind of role they've played in addressing land conflicts? Have they been useful, not useful? What do you think?
I would speak about that. There's a certain international dynamic to land ownership rights in Libya because of colonial legacy, because of the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. There has been an effort to forge documentation. There has been trips by Libyans to Italy and Istanbul to try and acquire original documentation of ownership going back 100 years and longer than that. And this is especially prevalent in the old city, the old sector of Tripoli, where there were huge amounts of private property seized by Gaddafi, including where my grandfather lived, which was Meydan Shuhada at that time. So the international dynamic in that sense hasn't necessarily been very helpful. Whether there are lessons to be learned on the property rights issue, because I haven't looked at the issue in detail, I couldn't say. But I would say that the issue of the Soviet bloc and what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the differentiation between public and private property, the effort to make the citizen acquire economic and political empowerment merely through the distribution of shares of state-owned companies is a very valuable lesson which must be learned for any future economic and political vision. People weren't able to feed themselves with shares, and they were transferable and weren't part of any kind of constitutional right for the Eastern European citizen, and therefore the oligarchs came and acquired them.
That was in Russia, not everywhere.
In Russia,
yes.
yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Please come have a drink, alcoholic or non-alcoholic. And thank you very much to our three panelists. And do get the report.